The crystal chandeliers sparkled above the crowd like 1,000 tiny stars. The ballroom was packed with people in expensive suits and glittering dresses. Everyone was there for the annual charity event at the Metropolitan Arts Center. It was the kind of place where a single ticket cost more than most people earned in a month. At the center of all the attention stood Vincent Chen, one of the most famous pianists in the world. He had just finished playing, and the applause was still echoing through the massive hall. People crowded around him, shaking his hand and telling him how brilliant he was. Vincent smiled and nodded, soaking it all in like sunshine. He was used to this. At 42 years old, Vincent had performed in every major concert hall across the globe. His face had been on magazine covers. Classical music websites wrote articles analyzing his every performance. He had won so many awards that he had stopped counting them years ago. But success had changed Vincent in ways he didn't even notice anymore. He had started to believe that his talent made him better than other people. He would roll his eyes when amateur musicians talked about their small performances. He made jokes about people who played piano just for fun. To him, if you weren't a professional, you weren't worth listening to. Tonight, Vincent was feeling particularly good about himself. His performance had been flawless. Every difficult passage, every complicated run of notes, every dramatic pause had been perfect. He could see it in the faces of the crowd. They were impressed, maybe even a little intimidated. As he chatted with a group of wealthy donors, Vincent noticed someone standing alone near the grand piano. It was a woman, probably in her mid-50s, wearing a simple navy blue dress that looked like it came from a department store clearance rack. She had no jewelry except for a small silver cross on a thin chain. Her shoes were practical, not fashionable. Her hair was pulled back in a neat bun, streaked with gray she hadn't bothered to color. She stood there quietly, just looking at the piano with an expression that Vincent couldn't quite read. It wasn't the usual tourist fascination. It was something deeper, almost sad. The woman's name was Elena, though no one at the party knew that yet. She worked as a night janitor at the city hospital, mopping floors and emptying trash bins while most people slept. She had gotten the ticket to this fancy event through pure chance. One of the event coordinators, a kind woman named Patricia, often worked late at the hospital for board meetings. Over months of late-night encounters, they had become friendly. When Patricia heard that Elena loved classical music, she insisted on giving her a complimentary ticket. Elena had almost not come. She had nothing appropriate to wear and felt out of place among wealthy people. But the chance to hear live piano music, to be in the same room as that beautiful instrument, was too precious to pass up. She had arrived early, slipped in quietly, and found a spot in the back during the performance. Vincent noticed several of his admirers had also spotted the woman. They were whispering to each other and glancing her way. One of them, a man in an expensive tuxedo, chuckled and said something Vincent couldn't hear. But he saw them all looking between Elena and the piano, and he got an idea. It was the kind of idea that felt clever and funny in the moment, especially after a few glasses of champagne. Vincent was feeling bold, maybe showing off a little. He wanted to entertain his wealthy audience, to give them a story they would tell their friends later. He excused himself from the group and walked toward Elena with confident strides. His shoes clicked on the polished marble floor. Several people noticed where he was going and started following, sensing that something interesting was about to happen. Elena was running her fingers gently along the edge of the piano, not quite touching the polished wood when Vincent approached her. She looked up, startled to see the famous pianist standing right in front of her. Vincent gave her an exaggerated bow, the kind that was almost mocking. His voice was loud enough that the growing crowd around them could hear every word. "Excuse me, madam," he said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I couldn't help but notice your fascination with this magnificent instrument. Perhaps you play?" Elena looked at him carefully. She could hear the tone beneath his polite words. She had heard that tone before many times in her life. It was the sound of someone who thought they were better than you, someone who assumed you were beneath them. "I have played," she answered simply, her accent soft but noticeable. She came from somewhere far away, somewhere most people in this room had probably never been. Vincent's smile grew wider. This was even better than he expected. "Wonderful," he announced, gesturing dramatically toward the piano. "Then you simply must honor us with a performance. We would all be absolutely delighted to hear you play. Around them, people were pulling out their phones. Some were already recording, anticipating an awkward moment they could share later. A few people giggled. Others looked uncomfortable but said nothing. The ballroom had fallen almost completely silent. Hundreds of eyes were on this plainly dressed woman who clearly didn't belong. They were waiting for her to get embarrassed, to make excuses, to hurry away with her face red. Vincent was certain she would refuse. Or maybe she would try to play something simple and childish, proving his point that real piano playing was for professionals like him, not for ordinary people who probably just plunked out simple tunes in their living rooms. But Elena didn't look embarrassed. She didn't look angry either. She just looked at Vincent with eyes that seemed to see right through him, past his expensive suit and his fame and his pride. For a moment, Vincent felt strangely uncomfortable, like a child being judged by a teacher. Then Elena did something no one expected. She nodded. "Yes," she said quietly. "I will play." The giggling stopped. The crowd went silent. Even Vincent's confident smile flickered for just a second. He had expected her to refuse, to run away, to give him the satisfaction of being right. Instead, she was calling his bluff. Vincent recovered quickly, gesturing toward the piano bench like a gracious host. "Excellent," he said, though his voice had lost some of its swagger. "Please, the stage is yours." People pressed closer, forming a tight circle around the piano. Phones were raised higher. Someone whispered to their friend, "This is going to be painful to watch." Another person murmured, "Why would he put her on the spot like that?" Elena walked toward the piano slowly. Her simple shoes made barely any sound on the floor. She didn't rush or hesitate. She moved like someone who had walked this path before, a long time ago. She reached the piano bench and stood there for a moment, looking down at the keys. From where Vincent stood, he could see her hands. They were rough, with calluses and small scars. These were working hands, hands that had scrubbed floors and lifted heavy things. They didn't look like the hands of a pianist. Elena adjusted the bench with small, precise movements. She sat down with perfect posture, her back straight but not stiff. She placed her hands on her lap and closed her eyes, taking one deep breath. The ballroom held its breath with her. Then Elena opened her eyes, lifted her hands, and placed them gently on the keys. The first note hung in the air like a question waiting to be answered. It was soft, almost gentle, but it was perfectly placed. Not a hint of nervousness. Not a tremor. Just a single pure sound that seemed to stop time itself. Then came the second note and the third. Elena's fingers began to move across the keys with a confidence that made several people in the crowd exchange confused glances. This wasn't what they expected. Not at all. Within seconds, everyone realized something was very different. This woman wasn't fumbling through a simple tune. She was playing Chopin. Not just any Chopin, but one of the most difficult pieces he ever wrote, the Ballad No. 1 in G minor. Even trained pianists struggled with this piece. It demanded technical skill, emotional depth, and years of serious study. Vincent felt his stomach drop. He knew this piece intimately. He had performed it hundreds of times. And he knew, within the first 10 seconds, that he was listening to someone who understood this music in ways he never had. Elena's rough, scarred hands moved across the keyboard like they were dancing. Her fingers flew through passages that required lightning speed, then slowed for the tender moments that needed a gentle touch. She never looked at the keys. Her eyes were closed, her face peaceful, like she was somewhere far away from this ballroom full of strangers. The opening section built slowly, full of questions and uncertainty. Elena played it with a sadness that felt real, not performed. You could hear longing in every phrase, like someone remembering a home they could never return to. Several people in the crowd felt their throats tighten. One woman reached for her husband's hand without thinking about it. Vincent stood frozen, his face burning. All around him, his wealthy admirers were completely silent. The phones that had been raised to capture an embarrassing moment were now recording something else entirely, something none of them would ever forget. The music began to shift. The gentle questioning turned into something more urgent, more passionate. Elena's whole body moved with the piece now. Her shoulders swayed. Her foot worked the pedal with perfect timing. She attacked the dramatic sections with fierce energy, her fingers striking the keys so hard you could feel it in your chest. This was where most pianists showed off their speed, their technical ability. But Elena wasn't showing off. She was telling a story. The fast, angry passages felt like someone fighting against impossible odds. The music spoke of struggle, of refusing to give up even when everything seemed lost. A professional musician standing near the back of the crowd whispered to his friend, "That's not just playing. That's living." His friend could only nod, too moved to speak. Vincent wanted to look away, to leave, to be anywhere but here, but he couldn't move. He was trapped by his own cruel joke, forced to witness something that was destroying every assumption he had ever made about music and about himself. The piece moved into its middle section, softer and more lyrical. Elena's playing became tender, almost like a lullaby. You could imagine a mother singing to her child, or someone remembering the few beautiful moments in a hard life. Her touch on the keys was so light, so delicate, that it seemed impossible those same rough hands had been playing with such power just moments before. Tears were streaming down people's faces now, and they didn't even try to hide them. A woman in a diamond necklace pulled a tissue from her purse with shaking hands. A man in his 70s stood perfectly still, his eyes closed, lost in the music. But then, standing near the edge of the crowd, someone gasped. An old man with white hair and glasses had pushed his way forward. He was staring at Elena like he had seen a ghost. His hands were pressed against his mouth and tears were running down his weathered cheeks. His name was Wilhelm, and he was the guest of honor at tonight's event. He was a legendary piano teacher, retired now, who had taught some of the greatest musicians of the past 50 years. People had paid thousands of dollars to sit at tables near him tonight. Wilhelm took a step closer to the piano, then another. His whole body was trembling. Several people noticed him and stepped aside, confused by his reaction. One of them asked quietly, "Professor, are you all right?" He didn't answer. He couldn't. All he could do was stare at Elena and listen. The music was building again now, heading toward the most difficult section of the entire piece. This was where the composition demanded everything from the pianist. Speed, power, emotional intensity, and absolute control all at the same time. Most professionals practiced this section for months before performing it in public. Elena played it like she had been born to do it. Her fingers flew across the keys so fast they blurred. The music exploded through the ballroom, filling every corner, every heart, every mind. It was angry and beautiful and desperate and hopeful all at once. It was the sound of someone who had lost everything and somehow found the strength to keep going. The chandelier seemed to shake with the power of it. People forgot to breathe. Some pressed their hands to their hearts. Others gripped each other for support. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was something sacred, something that touched the deepest parts of being human. Vincent felt something break inside him. It started as a crack, then grew wider. All his pride, all his certainty that he was special and better than others, all of it was crumbling. He realized with horrible clarity that he had been a fool. He had spent years perfecting his technique, memorizing every note, playing with precision and accuracy. But he had never played with a soul. Not like this. The piece raced toward its conclusion. The final section was a whirlwind of notes, a cascade of sound that required every ounce of skill and strength. Elena gave it everything. Her whole body moved with the music. Her face showed the strain, but her hands never faltered, not once, and then, with a series of powerful chords that seemed to shake the floor itself, it was over. Elena played the final notes and let them ring out into the silence. She kept her hands on the keys for a moment, her head bowed, her eyes still closed. The last vibrations of sound faded away slowly, reluctantly, like they didn't want to leave. The ballroom was completely silent. Not a cough, not a whisper, not even the sound of breathing. Hundreds of people stood frozen, unable to process what they had just witnessed. Elena slowly lifted her hands from the keys. She opened her eyes and looked down at her rough, working hands like she was surprised to find them there. A single tear rolled down her cheek, but she didn't wipe it away. 5 seconds passed, then 10. The silence stretched on, impossible and heavy. Then someone started to clap. It was the old professor, Wilhelm. His applause was slow at first, deliberate, the kind of clapping that said this moment mattered more than words ever could. Another person joined in. Then another. Then suddenly the entire ballroom erupted. The applause was deafening. People weren't just clapping politely like they had for Vincent earlier. They were standing, shouting, some of them sobbing as they applauded. Several people were on their feet, their hands raised above their heads, clapping until their palms hurt. Elena stood up from the piano bench slowly, looking overwhelmed and confused. She seemed surprised by the reaction, like she had forgotten there were other people in the room. She gave a small, awkward bow, nothing like Vincent's theatrical gestures from earlier, but the applause only grew louder. People surged forward, trying to get closer to her. Questions came from every direction, voices talking over each other. Who are you? Where did you study? Why have we never heard you play before? That was incredible. How is this possible? Elena stood there, surrounded by strangers, looking lost and small in her simple dress. She opened her mouth to answer, but no sound came out. She seemed overwhelmed, maybe even frightened by all the attention. Then Professor Wilhelm pushed through the crowd. People stepped aside for him automatically, respecting his age and status. He walked right up to Elena and stopped just inches from her face, staring at her like he couldn't believe his eyes. "Lenotchka," he whispered, using an old Russian nickname. "Is it really you?" Elena's eyes went wide when she heard that name. Her hand flew to her mouth and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. For a moment she just stared at the old professor, her whole body shaking. "Professor Wilhelm," she whispered back in a voice so soft that only those standing closest could hear. After all these years, the old man let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. Without hesitation, he pulled Elena into a tight embrace. His shoulders shook as he held her, this woman who had once been like a daughter to him. The crowd watched in confused silence, sensing they were witnessing something important but not understanding what it meant. When they finally pulled apart, Wilhelm kept his hands on Elena's shoulders, looking at her face like he was memorizing every detail. His voice was thick with emotion as he turned to address the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his accent still strong after 50 years in America. "You must forgive an old man his tears. But you see, I thought this woman was dead." A murmur rippled through the crowd. People pressed closer, desperate to hear more. Phones were still recording everything. This night had turned into something nobody could have predicted. Wilhelm wiped his eyes with a handkerchief from his pocket. "What you have just witnessed," he continued, his voice growing stronger, "was one of the greatest pianists of her generation. This is Elena Katerina Sokolov. More than 30 years ago, she was the brightest star at the Moscow Conservatory. At 22 years old, she won the International Tchaikovsky competition. Do you understand what that means?" He looked around at the faces staring back at him. Most of them didn't understand, so he explained. "That competition is one of the most prestigious in the world. Winning it is like an Olympic gold medal for classical musicians. She beat hundreds of the best young pianists from every country. The newspapers in Russia called her a national treasure. Her future was limitless. Vincent felt like he might be sick. He had mocked a Tchaikovsky competition winner. He had treated her like a joke, like someone beneath him. The shame was so intense it felt physical, like someone pressing down on his chest. "I was her teacher," Wilhelm continued, his voice cracking. "I taught her from the time she was 14 until she disappeared. She played with orchestras in Moscow, in Prague, in Vienna. Critics compared her to the legends. And then one day she was just gone. No goodbye, no explanation. We searched for months. We thought perhaps the KGB had taken her, or that she had died. We mourned her." He turned back to Elena, taking both of her hands in his. "What happened to you, my dear child? Where have you been?" The ballroom had gone so quiet you could have heard a pin drop. Everyone was leaning in, waiting for Elena's answer. She looked around at all the faces staring at her, at the phones recording her, at this room full of wealthy strangers in their expensive clothes. She looked down at her own simple dress, at her rough hands in Wilhelm's soft ones. "It is a long story," she said quietly. Her accent seemed thicker now, maybe because she was emotional or maybe because being with Wilhelm brought back memories of speaking Russian every day. "Not a happy one. Please," Wilhelm said gently. "These people deserve to know." "I deserve to know." Elena took a deep breath and nodded. Someone quickly brought her a chair and she sat down, suddenly looking very tired. Wilhelm stood beside her, one hand on her shoulder in support. "My younger brother Dmitri," Elena began, her voice steady but sad. "He was a journalist. He wrote articles about government corruption, about the truth that the authorities did not want people to know. This was still Soviet times, you understand. Such things were very dangerous." She paused, gathering her thoughts. The crowd waited patiently. Even Vincent had moved closer now, unable to stay away despite his shame. In 1991, just after I won the Tchaikovsky competition, they arrested Dmitri. They said he was a traitor, an enemy of the state. They sentenced him to 15 years in a labor camp in Siberia. My parents, they were already gone. I was all Dmitri had, and he had a wife and 2 little children, a boy who was 5 and a girl who was 3. Several people in the crowd made soft sounds of sympathy. A few women were crying openly now. I tried to help him, Elena continued. I used my fame to speak out. I gave interviews to foreign journalists. I thought maybe if enough people knew, they would have to let him go. She shook her head sadly. I was so young, so stupid. I did not understand how power works. What happened? Someone in the crowd asked softly. They came for me too, Elena said simply. In the middle of the night. 4 men in dark suits. They told me I would join my brother in Siberia. But Dmitri's wife, Anna, she had a cousin who worked at the airport. He helped me escape. I had 2 hours to leave the country or disappear forever. She looked down at her hands, remembering. I left with nothing. No papers except a fake passport, no money. No clothes except what I was wearing. I could not even say goodbye to Dmitri. I just ran. Wilhelm was crying again, understanding now why his brilliant student had vanished without a word. I came to America on a cargo ship, Elena went on. It took me weeks to get here. When I arrived, I had nowhere to go. I spoke almost no English. I had no documents to prove who I was. The name Elena Sokolov was on a Soviet watch list. If I used it, they would send me back. So I became Elena Martinez. I took the name from a woman who was kind to me at a shelter. She smiled sadly. I worked any job I could find. I cleaned houses. I washed dishes in restaurants. I learned English from television and from kind people who helped me. For 5 years, I saved every penny I could. Finally, I had enough money to bribe the right people, to get Anna and the children out of Russia after Dmitri died in that terrible place. More gasps from the crowd. This story was almost too painful to hear, but nobody could look away. They came to live with me, Elena said. 2 children who had lost their father, who spoke no English, who had nightmares every night. I became their mother. I worked 2 jobs, sometimes 3, to give them a life, to send them to school, to keep us safe and fed. There was no time for music. No money for music. And besides, how could I play? Every time I touched a piano, I remembered everything I had lost. It hurt too much. She looked around the ballroom at the crystal chandeliers and the expensive dresses. I have not played piano in 23 years, she said. Not until tonight. I came here only to listen, to remember, just for one evening, who I used to be. Wilhelm knelt down beside her chair, which was difficult for a man his age. He took her hands again. But you can still play, he said, his voice full of wonder. After 23 years with no practice, you played like that. It is a miracle. Elena shook her head. Not a miracle. Music is not something you can forget. It lives in here. She touched her heart. And here. She touched her head. The fingers remember, but more than that, I have lived a life now. I have known real loss, real fear, real love. When I was young, I played the notes perfectly, but I did not understand what they meant. Now I understand. She looked directly at Vincent then. He flinched but didn't look away. He owed her that much. You asked me to play as a joke, she said quietly, to embarrass me in front of all these people, to prove that you were better than me, better than some poor woman in a cheap dress. Vincent's face burned with shame. Several people in the crowd looked at him with disgust. But you gave me a gift, Elena continued, and there was no anger in her voice, only sadness. You reminded me that music was never about being better than anyone. It was never about fame or awards or proving anything. Music is about truth, about being human, about sharing what is in your heart. She stood up slowly, tired but somehow lighter, like telling her story had lifted a weight off her shoulders. Vincent couldn't take it anymore. The shame, the guilt, the horrible realization of what he had done crashed over him like a wave. His legs felt weak, but he forced himself to move forward through the crowd. People stepped aside, some of them giving him looks that ranged from pity to contempt. He walked right up to Elena and did something he had never done in his entire adult life. He dropped to his knees in front of her, right there on the polished ballroom floor in his expensive suit. His head bowed. His hands trembled. "Forgive me," he said, and his voice broke on the words. "Please forgive me." Tears streamed down his face, and he didn't try to hide them. I am a fool. Worse than a fool. I thought I was somebody important because I could play notes on a piano. I thought talent gave me the right to look down on others. I thought fame meant I was better than people who work regular jobs, who live quiet lives. He looked up at Elena, and there was real pain in his eyes. You have shown me what music really is, what it should be. I have played that same piece you just performed hundreds of times, thousands of times. I have played it in concert halls around the world, and people have applauded and called me brilliant. But I have never, not once, made anyone feel what you made us all feel tonight. Elena looked down at this famous man kneeling before her. She could have been angry. She would have had every right to be. He had tried to humiliate her in front of hundreds of people. He had judged her based on her clothes and her job and assumed she was nobody worth respecting. But when she looked at Vincent, she didn't see an enemy. She saw a man who had just learned a painful but necessary lesson. She saw someone whose whole view of the world had just been shattered. She recognized that look because she had worn it herself once, many years ago, when she lost everything and had to rebuild herself from nothing. She reached down and gently touched Vincent's shoulder. "Stand up," she said softly, "please. You do not need to kneel." Vincent stood slowly, wiping his face with the back of his hand. He looked like a different person than he had been an hour ago. The arrogance was gone. The casual cruelty was gone. What remained was someone raw and honest and hurting. "You play beautifully," Elena told him, and she meant it. "You have great skill, great technique. I heard your performance earlier. It was excellent. But it was empty," Vincent said quietly. "I see that now. I have been performing my whole life, but I have never really lived. How can I put real feeling into music when I have never struggled, never suffered, never lost anything that truly mattered?" Elena shook her head. "That is not true. Everyone suffers. Everyone loses things. Everyone struggles in their own way. Your pain is not less real just because it is different from mine. The problem is not that you have not suffered. The problem is that you forgot to pay attention. You forgot to be grateful. You forgot to be kind." The words hung in the air between them. Around them, the crowd listened in complete silence. This was not the entertainment they had expected when they bought their expensive tickets. This was something deeper, something real. "You are right," Vincent whispered. "I forgot what matters." Professor Wilhelm stepped forward then, placing a hand on Elena's arm. "My dear," he said, his voice urgent, "you must come back to music. You must teach. You must play. The world needs to hear you." Other voices joined in immediately. A woman in an elegant gown stepped forward. "I am on the board of the symphony," she said. "We would be honored to have you perform with us. Name your price." A man in an expensive suit spoke up. "I own 3 concert halls. You can have any of them anytime you want, free of charge." Another voice called out, "I will sponsor you. Whatever you need. A piano, a place to practice, anything." The offers came from every direction. People were pulling out business cards, calling out their connections, promising to help in whatever way they could. It was overwhelming. Within seconds, Elena was surrounded by people all talking at once, all wanting to be part of her return to music. But Elena held up her hands, and the crowd quieted. "You are all very kind," she said, "but I cannot accept." Confused murmurs rippled through the crowd. Wilhelm looked shocked. "But why not?" he asked. "This is your chance to reclaim everything you lost, to be who you were meant to be." Elena smiled, but it was a sad smile. "I am who I was meant to be," she said simply. "I clean floors at City General Hospital. I mop hallways at 3 in the morning. I empty trash cans and scrub toilets. And you know what? That work matters too." She looked around at all the confused, wealthy faces staring at her. "Last week," she continued, "I was cleaning the children's ward at midnight. There was a little girl, maybe 7 years old, who could not sleep. She was scared. She had cancer, and the treatments made her sick. Her parents had gone home to rest, and she was all alone." Elena's voice softened with the memory. "I sat with her for a while. I held her hand, and then I hummed a melody, something simple from Chopin. She asked me what it was, and I told her it was a lullaby from far away, from a place covered in snow. She fell asleep holding my hand." There were tears in Elena's eyes now, but they were different tears than before. That little girl did not care if I had won competitions or played in concert halls. She just needed someone to be kind to her, to make her feel less alone in the dark. That is what music should do. That is what everything should do. Wilhelm was nodding slowly, beginning to understand. But he pressed on. You could do both. You could teach at the conservatory during the day and still work at the hospital at night if you wanted to. No, Elena said firmly. I know myself. If I go back to that world, I will get swallowed by it. The competitions, the performances, the pressure to be perfect. I would lose myself again. I would forget the little girl in the hospital. I would forget what I learned from those 23 years of scrubbing floors. She turned to look at the grand piano behind her. Tonight was a gift, she said. You gave me a chance to visit an old friend, to remember a part of myself I thought was gone forever, but I do not need to live there. I can carry the music inside me wherever I go. A woman in the crowd spoke up, her voice hesitant. But what about Dimitri's children? The ones you raised? Surely they would want you to have this opportunity. Elena's face lit up with pride. Anna, my niece, is a doctor now. She works at the same hospital where I clean. Sometimes I see her rushing through the halls in her white coat, saving lives, and I think about Dimitri and how proud he would be. And Mikhail, my nephew, he is a teacher in the Bronx. He teaches English to immigrant children, helps them learn to read and write in their new language. She smiled. They offered to support me, to let me quit working so I could focus on music, but I told them no. They have their own lives to build, their own dreams to chase. I do not need them to take care of me. I take care of myself. And besides, I like my work. I like the night shift nurses who share their coffee with me. I like the security guard who tells me stories about his grandchildren. I like knowing that when I clean a room well, it helps keep patients safe from infection. Vincent had been listening to all of this with an expression of wonder on his face. You are remarkable, he said quietly. Truly remarkable. No, Elena corrected him gently. I am ordinary. That is what you do not understand yet. I am just an ordinary person who has lived an ordinary life full of ordinary joys and sorrows. Everyone has a story like mine. Everyone has lost things and found things and kept going. The woman who sold you your tuxedo has a story. The man who parked your car tonight has a story. The people who cook your food and clean your house and deliver your mail all have stories. She looked around the ballroom. The difference is that you asked me to play piano and I could show you my story through music. But what if you had asked one of them to share their gift? What if you had shown them the same respect you show people like Professor Wilhelm or the symphony board members? The words landed like stones in water, sending ripples through the crowd. People shifted uncomfortably. Some looked ashamed. Others looked thoughtful, perhaps seeing their maids and drivers and service workers in a new light for the first time. Professor Wilhelm stood quietly for a long moment, absorbing everything Elena had said. Then he did something that surprised everyone. He started to laugh. Not a cruel laugh, but a warm, joyful sound that came from deep in his chest. Ah, Lenotchka, he said, shaking his head with affection. You were always stubborn. Even as a young girl, once you made up your mind, there was no changing it. He wiped his eyes again, but this time he was smiling. But I have a proposal, not to bring you back to concert halls, just to share what you have with others who need it? Elena looked at him curiously. What do you mean? Teach, Wilhelm said simply. Not at the conservatory, not professionally. But perhaps you could teach children who cannot afford lessons. Children from families like yours, like mine, who came to this country with nothing. Children who have music inside them but no way to let it out. For the first time that evening, Elena hesitated. You could see the conflict on her face, the pull between protecting herself and the possibility of giving something meaningful to others. A man stepped forward from the crowd. He was younger, maybe in his 30s, casually dressed compared to everyone else. I run a community center in the South Bronx, he said. We have an old piano that nobody knows how to play. We have kids who hang out there after school because home is not safe or their parents work 3 jobs. If you could come even once a week just for an hour. He paused, choosing his words carefully. These kids, they think nobody cares about them. They think the world has already decided they do not matter. But if someone like you, someone who has lived through hard things and survived, if you showed them that music is for everyone, not just for rich people in fancy concert halls, that could change everything. Elena closed her eyes. When she opened them again, there were fresh tears, but her expression had softened. Once a week, she said quietly. On Saturday mornings, after my shift ends at 7, I could come at 9. For 2 hours, no more. I still need to sleep sometime. The man from the community center looked like he might cry too. That would be perfect, he said. More than perfect. But I have conditions, Elena added firmly. No publicity. No reporters. No posts on social media. This is not about me becoming famous again. This is private between me and the children. Do you understand? Completely, the man agreed quickly. I promise. Professor Wilhelm was beaming now, looking happier than he had all evening. And you must come to my house sometimes, he said. Just to play for yourself for the joy of it. I still have the Steinway from my teaching studio. It sits lonely now that I am retired. It would be good for both of you. Elena smiled at her old teacher. That I can do. That would make me happy. Vincent had been standing there watching all of this, and you could see him thinking hard about something. Finally, he spoke up, his voice humble in a way it probably had never been before. I would like to help, he said. At the community center. I do not mean perform or anything like that. I mean really help. Maybe I could buy new instruments for the kids. Maybe I could pay for sheet music or repairs or whatever is needed. The man from the community center started to respond, but Vincent held up his hand. Please let me finish. I also want to teach there. Not as a master teacher or a famous pianist, just as someone who knows music and wants to share it. I could work with the beginners, the ones who are just starting, if you will have me. You could hear the genuine humility in his voice. This was not a publicity stunt. This was a man who had been broken open and was trying to figure out how to rebuild himself into something better. Elena looked at Vincent for a long moment. Then she nodded slowly. Yes, she said. But you must promise me something. Anything, Vincent said immediately. Promise me you will never again judge someone by how they look or where they work. Promise me you will treat the janitor at your concert hall with the same respect you show the conductor. Promise me you will remember this feeling, this shame you feel right now, and let it make you kinder. Vincent nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He managed to whisper, I promise. What happened next would be talked about for years. The woman who had offered to sponsor Elena earlier, the one on the symphony board, spoke up again. If Elena will not perform, perhaps we could create something in her honor. A scholarship fund for musicians who have had to give up their dreams because of circumstances beyond their control. For refugees, for people escaping persecution, for anyone who lost their chance at music because life got in the way. The response was immediate. People started pulling out checkbooks right there in the ballroom. A man called out that he would donate $50,000. A woman topped him with $75,000. Within minutes, they had pledged over $500,000, and the number kept growing. Elena watched this with amazement, covering her mouth with her hands. I do not know what to say, she whispered. Say you will help us choose who receives the scholarships, Wilhelm suggested. Who better to understand what these students need than someone who has walked that path? Yes, Elena agreed. Yes, I can do that. As the evening wound down and people started to leave, something remarkable happened. Instead of just walking past Elena with polite goodbyes, people waited in line to speak with her. They thanked her not just for the performance, but for the lesson she had taught them. Many of them apologized for their own moments of judgment and cruelty, their own times when they had looked down on service workers or dismissed people who seemed ordinary. One wealthy woman admitted through tears that she had never learned the name of the woman who had cleaned her house twice a week for 7 years. I am going to fix that, she said, tomorrow, and I am going to ask her about her life, really ask and really listen. A businessman confessed that he always snapped at waiters when his food was not perfect. I never thought of them as real people with real lives, he said. I never thought about what they might be going home to, what struggles they might be facing. I am ashamed. Elena listened to each person with patience and kindness. She did not lecture them or make them feel worse. She just accepted their apologies and gently encouraged them to do better. Vincent stood off to the side watching all of this. When the crowd finally thinned, he approached Elena one more time. I need you to understand something, he said. Tonight changed my life. Not just my attitude or my perspective. My whole life. I am going to be a different person from now on. A better person. Because of you, Elena shook her head. Not because of me. Because you chose to be. I just held up a mirror. You decided what to do with what you saw. 3 months later, if you had walked into that community center in the South Bronx on a Saturday morning, you would have seen something beautiful. 20 children of all ages, sitting at beat-up keyboards and one old restored piano learning to play. Some of them were good, Some of them could barely find middle C, but all of them were focused, trying their best, their faces serious with concentration. At the front of the room stood Elena in jeans and a sweater, her hair in its usual bun, gently correcting finger positions and encouraging students who got frustrated. And in the back, working with the youngest children, sat Vincent. He wore regular clothes, no expensive suit. He had started taking the subway to get there instead of having his driver drop him off. He said it helped him remember what normal life was like. The video of Elena's performance had gone viral, of course. Millions of people had watched it. News outlets had tried to interview her, but she refused every request. The only statement she ever made was brief. Music is not about fame. It is about truth. It is about being human together. Vincent gave interviews, though. He talked openly about his arrogance and his cruelty. He talked about the lesson he learned and how it transformed him. Some people criticized him, said he was just trying to repair his image. But the people at the community center knew better. They saw him show up every week, even when he was exhausted from traveling. They saw him stay late to help kids who were struggling. They saw him listen to the children's stories with real interest, real care. One Saturday, a little girl named Rosa, maybe 8 years old, played a simple piece all the way through for the first time without any mistakes. It was just a basic melody, nothing fancy. But when she finished, she looked up at Elena with such pride and joy that it made everyone in the room smile. Elena knelt down beside Rosa's chair. "Beautiful," she said softly. "You played that with real feeling, like you did that night?" Rosa asked. "My brother showed me the video. You made everyone cry?" Elena smiled and tucked a strand of hair behind Rosa's ear. "You can make people cry too, mija. Not because you play fancy music in fancy places, but because you play with your heart, because you share something true." Vincent watched from across the room, and he understood something that he had been too blind to see for 42 years. Greatness was not about being better than other people. It was not about awards or recognition or standing ovations in concert halls. Greatness was showing up. It was being kind. It was using whatever gifts you had to make the world a little bit better, a little bit softer, a little bit more human. It was a woman in a cheap dress playing piano with rough, scarred hands and reminding everyone watching that we are all so much more than we appear to be, that everyone has depths we cannot see, that everyone deserves respect and kindness and the chance to share their gifts. As Elena started the next lesson, and the sound of imperfect music filled the room, Vincent felt something he had not felt in years. Not pride, not accomplishment, something simpler and more valuable. He felt grateful. Grateful for the humiliation that had opened his eyes. Grateful for Elena's grace. Grateful for a second chance to get life right. And grateful that he had been brave enough in the end to change.